What does it take to destroy a legend? Is it the weight of fame, the pressure of genius, or simply the human body surrendering to years of excess? On a warm summer night in Paris, in a modest apartment, far from the spotlight that had defined his existence, Jim Morrison answered that question in the most permanent way possible. The lead singer of The Doors, the poet who had become rock and roll royalty, the voice that had captivated millions, fell silent. He was just 27 years old. The bathtub in that Parisian apartment would become one of rock history's most haunting images, though no photograph exists. What happened in those final hours? Why did a man who seemed destined for immortality through his art find mortality so soon? To understand the end, we must journey through the blazing comet trail of Morrison's life. A story that burned so bright it could only consume itself. Paris in the summer of 1971 was supposed to be Morrison's escape, his sanctuary from the chaos that had engulfed his life in Los Angeles. He had arrived in March with his longtime companion Pamela Curson, seeking anonymity in the city of artists and poets. Gone was the leather-clad rock god. In his place walked a bearded, overweight man who looked older than his years, wearing simple clothes, wandering the streets like any other tourist. He wanted to write. He wanted to breathe. He wanted to be anyone other than Jim Morrison of The Doors. Those final weeks paint a portrait of a man caught between two worlds. He would sit for hours in Parisian cafes, scribbling in notebooks, sometimes poetry, sometimes rambling thoughts. The weight he had gained, the puffiness in his face, the labored breathing, these were the physical manifestations of years lived at full throttle. Friends who saw him during this period noticed the contradictions. Some days he seemed peaceful, genuinely happy to be away from the machinery of fame. Other days, darkness clouded his features, and he would drink heavily, his consumption of alcohol as excessive as ever. The relationship with Pamela was tempestuous as always, marked by passion and destruction in equal measure. They fought. They reconciled. They existed in their own private universe where love and toxicity intertwined so completely that neither could exist without the other. She was the only person who truly knew him, yet even she couldn't save him from himself. Did he want to be saved? That's the question that haunted everyone who knew Morrison. He seemed to be running towards something or away from everything, perhaps both simultaneously. On July 2nd, Morrison's last full day alive, nothing seemed particularly ominous. He went to see a movie. He visited a favorite café. He seemed in relatively good spirits, though friends would later recall he looked tired, worn down by something invisible. That evening, he and Pamela were home. What transpired in those final hours remains shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. There was no autopsy, no definitive medical examination. The official story would be written quickly, perhaps too quickly, leaving gaps that conspiracy theorists would fill with speculation for decades. Sometime in the early morning hours of July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison died. The details remain contested. Was he in the bathtub when death came? Did he die of heart failure, as the official report would claim? Were drugs involved beyond the alcohol that was always present? Pamela's account of finding him would be the primary source, but she herself would be dead less than 3 years later, taking whatever complete truth she knew to her own grave. What we know with certainty is this: the world lost one of rock's most enigmatic figures, and an era ended in that Parisian apartment. But who was this man before he became a myth? Who was Jim Morrison before the leather pants, before the arrests, before the legend consumed the person? James Douglas Morrison was born in Melbourne, Florida, in December of 1943, the son of a naval officer who would eventually rise to the rank of admiral. His childhood was one of constant movement, the military family relocating frequently, never settling long enough to plant deep roots. This nomadic existence would shape Morrison profoundly. He was always the outsider, always the new kid, always observing rather than belonging. Perhaps this is where the poet was born, in the spaces between places, in the role of eternal observer. From an early age, Morrison demonstrated a voracious appetite for literature and ideas. He devoured books on philosophy, poetry, and the occult. Nietzsche, Blake, Rimbaud, these were his companions, their words shaping his worldview. He was brilliant. There was no question about that. His intelligence was the kind that both blessed and cursed him, allowing him to see patterns and meanings that others missed, but also trapping him in his own mind's labyrinth. The pivotal event in young Jim's life came during a family road trip through New Mexico. He was just 4 years old when they came upon a horrific accident scene involving Native Americans. The image of the dying and injured would haunt Morrison for the rest of his life. He later claimed that the soul of a dying Native American had entered his body at that moment. Whether this was literal belief, poetic metaphor, or the beginning of his mythology building, it became central to his identity. The incident planted seeds of darkness and fascination with death that would bloom throughout his work. By the time Morrison enrolled at UCLA's film school in the mid-60s, he had already decided that conventional life held no appeal. He wanted to create, to provoke, to push boundaries. Film seemed like the perfect medium, but fate, or perhaps destiny, had other plans. On a Venice Beach afternoon in 1965, Morrison encountered Ray Manzarek, a fellow film student and keyboard player. When Manzarek asked if Morrison had been writing anything, the response would change rock history. Morrison shared some lyrics he had been working on, and Manzarek immediately recognized something special. The Doors were about to be born. What made the Doors different from the countless other bands emerging from the Los Angeles music scene? The answer was Morrison himself, and the unique alchemy he created with Manzarek, guitarist Robbie Krieger, and drummer John Densmore. The band had no bass player, an unusual choice that gave their sound a distinctive haunting quality. Manzarek's keyboard bass lines filled the low end, while his right hand wove hypnotic melodies. But it was Morrison's presence that elevated them from good to legendary. On stage, Morrison transformed. The shy, introspective film student became a shaman, a provocateur, a poet-priest conducting dark rituals disguised as rock concerts. His baritone voice could purr seductively or explode with primal rage. His lyrics mixed poetry with provocative imagery, sex with death, beauty with darkness. He didn't just perform songs. He created experiences that left audiences stunned, aroused, confused, and exhilarated. Their breakthrough came swiftly. In 1967, their debut album was released, and the rock world had never heard anything quite like it. The epic track that everyone remembers, that 11-minute journey through Morrison's psyche, became an anthem for a generation seeking to break through to the other side of consciousness. Radio stations initially resisted its length and darkness, but demand from listeners proved irresistible. The Doors had arrived and they were impossible to ignore. Success followed success. Album after album showcased Morrison's evolution as a lyricist. He wrote about love, but not the simple romantic kind. His love was complicated, dangerous, intertwined with power and surrender. He wrote about freedom, but recognized its terrifying implications. He wrote about death constantly, as if in conversation with an old friend. Looking back, it's chilling how much of his work seemed to predict his fate. But with fame came pressure, and Morrison handled it poorly. He had never wanted to be a rock star in the traditional sense. He wanted to be taken seriously as a poet and artist. The screaming teenagers, the commercial machinery, the expectations, these things suffocated him. He began drinking more heavily. His behavior on stage became increasingly erratic and dangerous. Would he give them the performance they wanted, or would he sabotage the entire show? Nobody ever knew, perhaps not even Morrison himself. The concerts became unpredictable events. Sometimes Morrison would deliver performances of staggering power and beauty. Other times he would show up drunk, belligerent, barely able to stand. He taunted audiences, provoked them, tried to start riots. What was he looking for in these moments of chaos? Authenticity? Freedom from the role he was expected to play? Or was he simply self-destructing in the most public way possible? The turning point came in Miami in March of 1969. What happened on that stage would effectively end Morrison's career in America. The accounts vary wildly. Did he actually expose himself, or was it merely suggested through gesture and implication? The chaos that followed was indisputable. Morrison was arrested, charged with indecent exposure and profanity. The trial would drag on for years, hanging over him like a sword. Many venues refused to book the doors. The FBI opened a file. Morrison, already struggling, found himself trapped in legal proceedings that drained him financially and emotionally. During this period, Morrison's drinking spiraled further out of control. He had always been a heavy drinker, but now alcohol consumed him as thoroughly as fame had. Friends watched helplessly as he deteriorated. His weight ballooned. His face, once classically handsome, became bloated and worn. The leather pants no longer fit the expanding frame. The mystique was crumbling, revealing the damaged human beneath. Yet somehow, the Doors continued creating. Their later albums showed Morrison's maturing as a lyricist, even as his personal life fell apart. The music became more blues-influenced, rawer, stripped of the psychedelic embellishments of earlier work. These albums would be underappreciated at the time but later recognized as some of their finest work. Morrison was finding his voice as an artist even as he lost himself as a person. By early 1971, Morrison had made his decision. He would leave America, leave the Doors, leave everything behind. Paris beckoned the city of Baudelaire and Verlaine, where he could pursue his first love, poetry, without the burden of rock stardom. The other members of the Doors supported his need for a break, though they must have wondered if he would ever return. Morrison himself probably didn't know the answer. Those months in Paris, as we've seen, were Morrison's attempt at rebirth. He wanted to shed the rock god persona and return to his roots as a poet. He worked on his writing. He recorded some poetry in a studio, his voice different from his singing voice, more contemplative, vulnerable. These recordings would be released posthumously, giving fans a glimpse of the artist Morrison wanted to be. But demons don't respect geographical boundaries. The drinking continued. The self-destructive patterns persisted. You can't outrun yourself, no matter how far you travel. Paris offered him anonymity, but not peace. The weight of everything he had been and everything he couldn't be followed him across the Atlantic. And then came that July night. The end arrived without fanfare, without witnesses beyond Pamela, without the dramatic public exit one might expect from someone who had lived so theatrically. In death, Morrison found the privacy that had eluded him in life. The news of Morrison's death took days to reach the public. There was no immediate announcement, no press conference. When the world finally learned that Jim Morrison was gone, the reaction was disbelief. How could this force of nature simply cease to exist? The circumstances, shrouded in mystery and contradictions, only fueled speculation. To this day, conspiracy theories persist. Some claimed he faked his death to escape fame. Others suggested sinister forces were involved. But the simplest explanation is often the truth. A man who had abused his body for years, who had pushed every limit, finally ran out of road. The funeral was small, private, held quickly before the press could descend. Morrison was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, joining the ranks of famous artists and writers interred there. His grave would become a pilgrimage site, covered in graffiti, offerings, and declarations of love from fans who felt they had lost not just a singer, but a part of themselves. For the Doors, Morrison's death marked the end. They attempted to continue for a while, but it was clear that the band's soul had departed with Morrison. The door had closed permanently. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore would carry on individually, but the Doors, as the world knew them, existed no more. The legacy Morrison left behind transcends music. Yes, the Doors created iconic songs that still resonate today, generations after their creation. But Morrison's influence extends into the realm of cultural mythology. He became the archetype of the doomed romantic poet, the artist too intense for this world, the genius consumed by his own fire. Jim Morrison joined the tragic club of the 27 Club alongside other brilliant musicians who died at that cursed age. What is Morrison's true legacy? It's complicated as the man himself. On one level, he's a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess, about the price of fame, about the futility of trying to outrun your demons. His death, senseless and preventable, serves as a reminder that talent doesn't protect you from the consequences of your choices. But there's another legacy, one that countless artists and poets cite when discussing their inspirations. Morrison proved that rock music could be intelligent, literate, and provocative. He showed that performers could be poets, and that poetry could be performed. He pushed boundaries, challenged audiences, and refused to play by the rules of the music industry. In an era of manufactured pop stars and corporate rock, Morrison's authenticity, however self-destructive, shone through. His words continue to resonate because they spoke to something fundamental in the human experience. The desire for freedom, the fear of death, the search for meaning, the intoxication of excess. These themes are timeless. Morrison articulated them with a combination of poetic imagery and raw emotion that few could match. When people read his poetry or listen to his music today, they're not just experiencing art from the past. They're connecting with ideas and feelings that remain relevant. Perhaps most significantly, Morrison represented possibility. He showed a generation that you didn't have to accept the conventional path laid out before you. You could rebel, create, experiment, and push against the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Yes, his example also showed the dangers of taking rebellion too far, but the spirit of questioning authority and seeking authenticity inspired millions. The mystique around Morrison has only grown in the decades since his death. He never aged, never compromised, never became a parody of himself. He remains frozen in time at 27, eternally young, eternally dangerous, eternally mysterious. This preservation of image, tragic as its cause was, has kept Morrison relevant in a way that many of his contemporaries, who lived longer and saw their legends diminish, never achieved.
For fans, Morrison represents something deeply personal. Ask anyone why they connect with his
music and his poetry, and you'll get different answers. Some see him as a voice for the outsider, the misfit, the person who doesn't quite fit into society's boxes. Others respond to the raw sexuality and dangerous charisma he projected. Still others connect with the poetry, the intellectual depth, the literary references and philosophical provocations. Morrison contained multitudes, and different people see different aspects reflected back at them. The tragedy of Jim Morrison isn't just that he died young, it's that he seemed to be on the verge of transformation when death claimed him. Those poetry recordings from Paris hint at a new direction. Had he lived, would he have found peace with himself? Would he have created the great poetry collection he dreamed of? Would he have returned to the Doors or struck out on an entirely new path? We'll never know. What we have instead are the what-ifs, the might-have-beens, the alternative histories that fans and scholars debate endlessly. Morrison once said that he saw himself as a huge fireball, and that he was interested in anything about revolt, disorder, and chaos. He lived that philosophy completely, and it killed him. But in living it, he created something that outlasted his physical existence. The music remains, the words remain, the legend remains. What drives someone to burn so brightly that they consume themselves? Is it genius finding its only possible expression, or is it tragedy that could have been prevented with different choices? The answer, frustratingly, is probably both. Morrison was brilliant and self-destructive, talented and troubled, charismatic and damaged. These contradictions didn't exist separately, they were intertwined, each feeding the other.
As we reflect on Morrison's life and death over 50 years after that Paris night, certain truths emerge.
Fame amplifies whatever exists within a person, and in Morrison, it amplified both brilliance and darkness. Talent doesn't equal happiness. In fact, it can sometimes create additional burdens that ordinary people never face. And running away from your problems, even to Paris, only works if you can leave yourself behind, which is impossible. But perhaps the most important truth is this. Despite the tragic ending, despite the waste of potential, despite the pain he caused himself and others, Jim Morrison created something of lasting value. The music he made with the Doors continues to move people. His poetry continues to provoke thought. His image continues to inspire. That's not nothing. That's a legacy that many who live much longer never achieve. The door closed on July 3rd, 1971, in a Parisian apartment, when a 27-year-old man took his last breath. But in another sense, a door opened that day, one that leads into mythology, legend, and immortality of the cultural kind. Jim Morrison died, but the Lizard King, the poet, the shaman, the voice that once commanded stadiums and still whispers through headphones around the world, that version of Jim Morrison will never die. Was it worth it? That's a question only Morrison could answer, and his silence on the matter is eternal. What we can say is that his brief, blazing passage through this world left marks that haven't faded with time. For better or worse, for inspiration or cautionary tale, for music or mythology, Jim Morrison matters. He mattered then, and he matters now. The final irony is that Morrison, who seemed to be seeking some kind of transcendence through excess, through poetry, through performance, achieved it through death. He became the myth he was trying to create in life. The man who sang about breaking through to the other side finally did, though not in the way anyone would have chosen. So we remember Jim Morrison not just for how he died, but for how he lived intensely, authentically, fearlessly, and fatally. We remember the voice that could shift from a whisper to a roar. We remember the words that challenged and provoked. We remember the performances that blurred the line between concert and ritual. We remember the beauty and the darkness, the poetry and the chaos, the legend and the man. The doors closed forever in Paris, but the light that burned within them, the light that was Jim Morrison, still illuminates the path for those who seek something more than the ordinary, something dangerous and beautiful and true. That light cost Morrison everything, but it gave the world something irreplaceable. And that, perhaps, is the only way to make sense of a senseless tragedy, to recognize what remains when everything else is gone.